Let me tell you something before we go on, and then I will be done with it. I did not have any grand plan. I just had to hold steady through what was left, because even after you pay, the county can still find a way to take away what you thought you had gotten back. So this last part is about the margin and the line. Those 10 days did not pass with anything you could point at. The fields did not change color. The branch below the sycamore did not alter its steady course over the big rocks. Still, the air around the house felt thinner, like every footstep carried the possibility of being overheard by somebody who calculated advantage for sport. I moved through those days with the same calm I had carried through fire and chase, but the awareness of that margin pressed under every task. It was not fear, exactly. It was vigilance, and vigilance is its own kind of fatigue. I woke each morning listening first, not for birds or the pump handle, but for tires. Even when there were none, my body kept that readiness like a habit. I would stand at the window a moment and look at the road beyond the trees, and then I would make myself turn away and do what needed doing, because you cannot stare a deadline into changing its mind. Mama watched me the way she always watched when something heavy was moving through the house, quiet and steady, like her gaze was enough to keep the walls from shifting. I did not stop my work running the still. I finished what was going. The big barrels that were fermenting were allowed to turn. I assembled the still one last time with deliberate care, like I was closing a door instead of opening a corridor. The copper responded to heat, the way it always had, giving up its clear stream into waiting jars. Even so, I watched the drip, feeling differently about it all. Each drop felt less like distance crossed, and more like an answer to a question put off for a later day. The problem was, I could not pretend the answer did not matter now that the pressure had eased. The barn carried that familiar smell of grain and damp wood, and it also carried the memory of that chase, even though it didn't end there. That is what happens after you are chased by something bigger than your dreams see. The place you were safe starts holding the shape of danger too, and you must work until the danger loses its claim to feel safe again. I kept the fire low and patient, and I kept my hands from shaking by giving them jobs like checking seals, tightening fittings, and wiping down copper until it dulled back into something ordinary. Cass kept moving product through those first days of the upset period, but he did it with less swagger than before. He stopped talking about margins and demand. He came when called, loaded what was ready, and left without commentary. The renegotiated rate held. Whatever Eli put in him with that measured conversation in town had not faded, and Cass acted differently because of it. Men like him did not like being watched. No one liked being caught, even less than being suspected. There was a difference in how he carried himself, too. His shoulders sat tighter, and his eyes went to the tree line before they came to my face. He said he still wanted profit, and I knew he still wanted control of it all. But when he came by, it seemed he wanted silence more than he wanted bragging. I had learned from watching Daddy that silence makes a man careful, in ways he does not always enjoy. I did not mention the chase, and did not ask for details, but I am sure that is what changed him. He was one of the kind of men who live by night, but did not go digging for stories that might turn into confession. On the 4th day, I saw Daddy speaking with Cass near the fence line that bordered our pasture. There were no raised voices. Daddy stood with his hands loose behind his back, posture straight but not rigid. Cass faced him with his hat off and listened more than he spoke. I could not hear their words from where I was, but Daddy's head inclined once or twice while Cass nodded slow. At the end, Cass put his hat back on and walked to his car without haste. I did not go out there, and I didn't ask either of them later. In our family, the most important decisions often got made in the spaces where nobody asked permission to make them, and questions were treated like disrespect. Feeling unsure about things, I went back to the barn at Granny's. I lifted one jar from the plank, holding it up to the filtered light. It was as clear as it ought to be. No cloudiness, no flaw, just the result of doing what Granny had written down. I set it back in line and covered the row with burlap, and tried to pretend my mind was not counting down the days. Those 3 remaining days passed the way time always passes, whether you watch it or not. I rose early and worked fields beside Daddy. I helped Mama with her remaining chickens and vegetable patch. I checked Granny's barn with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession. I counted hours without saying them aloud. Mama moved quiet through the house, and that courthouse receipt stayed folded and tucked into the Bible on the mantel, like proximity to Scripture could anchor it more firmly to reality. Faith and paper do not always mix, but Mama, and I think Daddy, believed in putting your hope where you could see it. Some nights I would stand in the doorway of Granny's barn and listen to the branch, and I would remember the way glass sounded when it broke that night. It was still sharp and final in my ears, that light sweeping across the field, and the way Backlash's muscles tightened under me when I asked him for more as the beam got closer. Then I would look at Mama's hands in lamplight, mending something that did not need mending, and I would understand she was doing the same thing I was. We were both keeping our hands busy so our minds did not run wild. On the 10th day, the sky was high and pale blue, like the inside of a ceramic bowl. I went into town with Daddy, not to speak at the counter, but to stand within sight of it. The courthouse floor had that same worn sheen it always had. The clerk who took our payment sat behind the desk, with the same steady posture I imagined, the ink and wood and habit wrapped up in his face. A ceiling fan turned slow overhead, stirring warm air that smelled faintly of cleaner and old paper, mixed with the smell of old boots scuffing across the floor, like they had been for 100 years before. Daddy stepped forward and asked without embellishment. The clerk checked the ledger, ran a finger down a column of figures, and shook his head once. No upset bid had been filed. The period had lapsed. The words did not ring or echo. They just settled into the space between wood and ink and air, and I felt my breath ease out slow, not in loud relief, but in acknowledgement of a line crossed and held. Daddy did not smile, but I didn't expect him to show any emotion. We had both been taught that joy spoken too loud draws attention, and attention invites trouble. Still, when we turned away from that counter, the weight in my chest shifted, not gone, but moved, like the stone rolled off the tomb. Outside, the sunlight looked the same as it had when we walked in, but it felt different on my skin, like warmth and not a burn. We drove home without talking. The road curved through the pine stands and the waiting fields of corn. Back on the Bost's land, it presented itself the same as it had the day Eli first carried that notice up the gravel cut. Granny's house stood with its sagging porch and curled tin, unchanged by ledger entries and deadlines, and that sameness was its own kind of blessing. The sycamore down by the branch, with its pale bark in the light, still watched it the way it always had, though it all. That evening, as light thinned toward dusk, Daddy, Mama, and I all stood by the fence line where pasture met the slope down toward the branch. He had a length of wire in his hands, and he was twisting it around a post that had loosened over time. The post leaned a little, and he pressed it deeper into the hard ground with measured force and tightened the wire again. When he finished, he straightened and tested tension with his palm, like a man confirming the world was still in order. Only then did he speak. "Your grandmother never cared to owe a man," he said. His eyes stayed on the fence, not on me. The statement carried no flourish and no claim of credit. It stood as fact, offered plain. I understood more in that one sentence than I would have from pages of apology or praise. I remembered seeing him with Cass by the fence days earlier. I remembered the angle of his shoulders and that quiet nod at the end as Cass walked away. Whatever passed between them did not require my presence, and I am sure it didn't require my gratitude. But I thought it did mean he had stepped into a fight he claimed he did not believe in. He had done it his way, without admitting it. I inclined my head once and walked past him toward the barn, because that was how we spoke in our family when words were too small. The air smelled like fertile earth and distant wood smoke. Backlash grazed in the lower pasture, slow and untroubled, like he knew trouble was a human hobby. Inside the barn, jars from my last run stood in neat rows along the plank. Copper pieces rested disassembled under canvas and rope and waited for me to put them away. I climbed to the loft and went to the small tin box where Granny kept scraps of paper and notes in that tight, economical hand of hers. I pulled out the recipe and unfolded it. It was not written for strangers. It was written for blood. Measurements listed without ornament, notes in the margins about water drawn above the bend in the branch, and fire kept low and patient. Ink faded some with time, but it was still legible, and the steadiness of her handwriting made my chest tighten in a way that was not sorrow and not pride. She wrote with a strong hand. I could see her in that ink, the way she never wasted words, the way she did not dress anything up for comfort. I held that paper and felt the weight of choice settle different than it had during those 30 days of urgency and 10 days of unease. I had began with simple arithmetic, and I proved to myself I could turn grain and heat into what was needed. I proved I could negotiate margin without raising my voice. I proved I could ride through pursuit without losing my seat. The land stood secure now, not because of sentiment, but because labor and discipline still mattered in a world that acted like they did not. I had proved that her words were as strong today as they were back then. What remained after that was not fear. It was the question of what kind of life I wanted once I no longer needed the dark to keep a deed in the family. Freedom is a heavier thing than people admit, because it means you cannot blame the next step on necessity. It means you have to choose, and choosing puts your name on it. Later, back at home, I went out the back door and stepped outside into that space between the barn and the house, where we kept a burn barrel. Evening had deepened, sky shading toward indigo, and the first insects were starting their steady chorus. I unfolded the recipe and read it top to bottom without haste. The words did not tremble in my hands. They were steady like the branch, steady like a fence line tightened right, steady like a match before you strike it. I struck a match against the side of the barrel. Its flame flared bright and contained, then settled into that smaller, determined burn past the head. I held the receipt above it long enough to feel warmth rising against my knuckles, and then I lowered it until the edge caught. The paper darkened, curled, and began to feed the fire. The sound of it was clear in the quiet old ink and dry fiber, surrendering without spectacle. I watched until the last corner blackened and folded inward, until the flame took what had once been instruction and inheritance together. People hear this story and think it is about shame. That sin is an easy answer to hard questions. It is not the truth. This story was about a line of strength. A woman's way saved the land when no man was willing, and that hasn't changed. But I don't want the land held by copper and secrecy forever. I wanted it held by choice, by work that does not require darkness, and by a future where you, my granddaughter, doesn't have to learn arithmetic with a gunshot in the distance. This land lays beyond us in shadow and pale bark and steady water, and in that moment of triumph, I understood it was not held by copper or margin. It was held by what you decide you will become, and what you refuse to keep becoming once the danger passes. I watched the last ash settle. Then I turned and listened to the night a moment. The branch kept moving. The house kept standing. Backlash shifted in the pasture and went back to grazing, and the world did not applaud or condemn what I had done. The world simply kept going, which is how you know the choice was yours and not the world's. That is the whole of it, baby, the part that belongs to this telling. The land stayed put, and so did we, and that is enough for one story. Come on now, set your glass down and let your shoulders drop. I am done talking, and we are going to let the rest of this evening be quiet.